Creek Studios.
In Appalachia, sometimes things sit in the background for so long, they simply become part of the landscape. You pass them every day without noticing them. They've been there your whole life, and then one day, out of nowhere, you finally see them. There are several things like that here in these rural mountains, and if you drive north on Interstate 81 through Smyth County, Virginia, just before the 7-mile Ford exit, there's an old brick house sitting quietly back from the road that is just like that. Most people pass by it without noticing, but for more than a century, it has carried stories that refuse to disappear. Some of them go back to the days when travelers moved along the wilderness road, when a rough tavern stood on that same piece of land. But strangely enough, the most unusual story connected to it might not come from the 1800s at all. It might come from the last woman who lived there in the 1900s. A woman who wrote books, carried a revolver on her hip, and lived almost completely alone in a house full of history. If you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday, and if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. In this episode, we're traveling to a stretch of land beside the middle fork of the Holston River, near 7-mile Ford, Virginia, to a place that's been watching this section of Appalachia for nearly 200 years. And depending on who you ask around here, it may have been keeping secrets even longer than that. To understand this house that sits by the interstate, we have to go back before there was ever an interstate running through this valley. Back before tractor and trailers rumbled past the 7-mile Ford exit day and night. Back to a time when this part of southwest Virginia was still a rough frontier, and the road through the Holston River Valley was little more than a narrow path worn into the ground by wagons, horses, and thousands of footsteps heading west. In the late 1700s, this area was part of the edge of the American frontier. The land along the middle fork of the Holston River was rich and fertile, and settlers were beginning to move into the area in larger numbers, carving out farms and homesteads. One of those early settlers was a man named William Campbell. Campbell was already well known in this part of Virginia, a militia leader during the Revolutionary War. He commanded frontier soldiers in one of the most important battles of the war, the Battles of King Mountain in 1780. After the war ended, Campbell returned home to the area and built his estate along the river, a place he called Aspenvale. Campbell died in 1781 and was buried there at Aspenvale, just a few miles up the river from where we're talking about today. At that time, the land that now surrounds 7-mile Ford wasn't divided the way it is today. Much of it was larger family tracts connected to early frontier families who settled here. The Campbells, the Prestons, and the Russells. And running right through the middle of it all was the Wilderness Road. It was one of the main routes through the mountains, carrying settlers, traders, soldiers, and travelers deeper into the Appalachian frontier. If you were moving through the valley 200 years ago, chances are you passed right along that road. Traveling through here in the late 1700s and 1800s was nothing like it is today. The road that would later become known as the Wilderness Road was really just a narrow route worn into the ground by wagon wheels and horses. In 1775, Daniel Boone and a group of 35 axemen blazed a path through forest, along ridges, and down into the river bottoms through the Cumberland Gap. A journey that might take you 20 minutes by car today could easily take an entire day on horseback. And it wasn't always a safe journey. Travelers moving through the frontier had to think about things most people today never had to worry about. Sudden storms in the mountains, swollen rivers that could trap wagons for hours, wild animals roaming the woods, and sometimes gangs and robbers. Because of that, most people tried to avoid traveling after dark whenever they could. When night started coming upon you, you started looking for a place to stop. Somewhere with a fire, a roof overhead, and other people nearby. This part of the road became one of those stopping points because of the river itself. Long before the bridges crossed the Holston River, travelers had to guide their wagons and horses through shallow sections of the river called fords. These crossings became landmarks along the road, and people often measured distance between them. The crossing here was said to be about 7 miles from a nearby settlement known as Royal Oak, present-day Marion, Virginia. And over time, the place simply became known as 7 Mile Ford. For weary travelers coming down that long mountain road, reaching the ford meant they were close to water, open ground, and hopefully a place where they could stop for the night before continuing their journey. A place where a traveler could get a hot meal, maybe a drink, and a bed for the night. And one of those places, a rough log tavern, stood on the very piece of land where the old brick house now sits. And if the stories passed down are true, that tavern may have been the last stop some travelers ever made. Exactly who built that first structure isn't clear today, and there are no surviving records that describe it in detail, but stories about it have lingered here for generations. According to local legend, the man who kept that tavern had a dark reputation. In those days, this valley saw a steady stream of people heading west. Families moving into Kentucky and Tennessee passed through here with wagons and horses. Drovers pushed herds of cattle, hogs, horses, and mules east towards markets. And many of those travelers carried money with them, sometimes tucked away in money belts or hidden in saddlebags, which meant that stopping for the night along the road could be risky. More than a few travelers stopped at that old tavern for lodging and were never seen again. Neighbors spoke about strange things happening in the woods nearby. People talked about stumbling across freshly dug earth in certain hollows. Stories of midnight grave diggings. Now, whether those stories are true or simply the kind of tales that grow along lonely roads, it's impossible to know. However, according to the book Smyth County History and Traditions, written in 1932, in 1892, something happened that only added to the mystery. A small cave was discovered not far from the property. Inside were 21 skeletons. One of those skeletons was said to be that of a woman with a child still in her arms. A local doctor later examined the bones and reportedly believed that they dated back to the same time period when that old tavern stood along the road. No one was ever able to prove exactly where the remains had come from, but around 7 Mile Ford, the story became part of the local landscape. Sometime in the early 1840s, the story of that old roadside tavern begins to fade from the historical record. What replaces it is something far easier to see. The families connected to this land were some of the earliest and most influential in southwestern Virginia. William Campbell, whose estate Aspenvale stood just up the river, had married Elizabeth Henry, the sister of Patrick Henry, the same Patrick Henry who would become one of the voices of the American Revolution. Through marriages and family ties over the years, those Campbell connections eventually flowed into the Preston family, and in 1842, Captain John Montgomery Preston built the large brick home, not originally intended for a residence, but as a tavern and inn to replace the old log cabin and the terrible history behind it. And the new building he built was nothing like the rough log structures that had come before it. A local historian who had studied the property for years described the house to me as mansion-like for its time and place. Nearly 24 rooms. It had a massive central entryway, large formal parlors, and tall windows that stretched nearly from floor to ceiling. The fireplaces inside were enormous, so large, she said, that you could almost imagine laying a queen-size bed inside of one. And according to current property records, the structure spreads out to more than 11,000 square feet, Nearly 8,000 square feet of that was living space, spread across the first floor and a large finished upper story. To put that in perspective, the average size of a house in Virginia today is around 2,000 square feet. The Preston House was almost 4 times that size. And that doesn't even count the massive unfinished attic above it, or the porches that wrapped around parts of the home, and the basement. For travelers who would have spent days moving along the muddy roads of the frontier, a structure like that would have stood out and would have been a sight for sore eyes after many days and hours traveling by wagon or horseback on the rough wilderness road. And in 1864, Captain Preston converted it into a residence and took his bride to live there. And over the years, it would see far more history pass through its doors than the people who built it could ever have imagined. Because by the time the Civil War came to southwestern Virginia, the house would find itself standing directly in the path of marching armies. For more than 32 years, the large home served travelers moving through the area. But in the early 1860s, the kind of travelers passing through the area began to change. Instead of wagons and settlers, soldiers started appearing on the road. During the Civil War, this area became an important route for armies moving between the states. Troops from both sides passed through, and dwellings along the road were often taken over as temporary headquarters or camps. And the Preston House was no exception. According to local accounts and historic records, both Confederate and Union soldiers occupied the house at different times during the war. The large rooms that once welcomed weary travelers were now filled with troops, equipment, and horses. When Union General George Stoneman rode through this region on his raid across southwest Virginia, his troops took possession of the house. Soldiers reportedly hacked beef on the mahogany tables, stabled horses inside the halls, and instead of cutting nearby trees for firewood, well, they turned to something much closer: the furniture inside the house. Chairs, tables, and wooden pieces that once filled the rooms of the house were broken apart and thrown into the fireplaces to keep the soldiers warm. And according to some, evidence to verify these claims is still found in the house today, as you can see horseshoe marks still on the wooden floor. When the war finally ended and the soldiers moved on, the house slowly settled back into something resembling normal life. Captain John Preston and his family continued to live there, and for many years the property became a gathering place for the Preston family. By the earliest 20th century, John Preston's wife and their daughter, Miss Nellie Preston, were still living in the house. And according to the book written in 1932, the place was not quiet for very long. During the summer months, relatives from across the region would come to visit. The old house that once sheltered travelers along the Wilderness Road would again fill with people, cousins, children, and extended family connections arriving to spend summertime there together. Sometimes as many as 50 people might be staying there at once. Rooms once again filled with conversations, tables crowded with meals. The place that had seen frontier travelers, soldiers, and stagecoach passengers now served a different purpose, holding together generations of one family. And for decades, the Preston House remained exactly that, a place where the family returned, summer after summer, to gather beside the old road. And one of the most remarkable things about it wasn't just the building itself, it was what was kept inside. For many years, it held an extraordinary collection of historic documents, letters, papers, and records connected to the earliest days of the Appalachian frontier. Among them were original letters written and signed by men whose names still appear in American history books: General William Campbell, Colonel Arthur Campbell, Colonel William Preston. There were even letters written by George Washington himself, along with correspondence bearing the handwritten signatures of Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, and Patrick Henry. In the late 1800s, an historian by the name of Lyman C. Draper from the State Historical Society of Wisconsin visited the Preston House while gathering materials for his research on the western frontier. According to accounts from the family, Draper immediately recognized that the house contained an extraordinary historical archive. It is said by the owners he borrowed a large number of those papers, promising to copy them and return the originals. But the documents never made its way back to Virginia. Instead, many of them became part of what is now known as the Draper Manuscript Collection in Madison, Wisconsin, a massive archive used by historians studying the early American frontier. And what remained of the collection at the Preston House, over time, were eventually sold to the Library of Congress, so they could be preserved. So in a way, the history of that old house in 7 Mile Ford ended up scattered across the country. Some of it preserved in Washington, D.C., some of it preserved in Wisconsin, and some of it, well, still lingering inside its walls. But the strangest chapter in its story was still many years away, because long after the war ended, a woman would move into the house who would become almost as mysterious as the legends that surround it. And as a side note, the last occupant, the one we're going to talk about next, well, the more I researched for this episode, talking with relatives, local historians, and people who actually knew her, something slowly began to dawn on me. Her story can't be told in the few remaining minutes that we have. The truth is, the more I learned about her life, the more it became clear that she deserves something more than a brief mention at the end of someone else's story. She deserves her own. So sometime in the future, we're going to come back to her. And when we do, we'll give her story the time it deserves. But for now, we'll stay with the part of her life that connects to this house. Because by the middle of the 20th century, the old Preston House had gained a new resident, a writer named Lucy Herondon Crockett. To understand the final chapter of The House Beside the Road, you have to understand the woman who would one day live there. Lucy was not someone who had spent her entire life in the hills of Real Appalachia. She was born in 1914 in Hawaii, at a time when the islands were still a U.S. territory, long before it became a state. Her father, Colonel Cary Ingram Crockett, was serving there during his military career, and Lucy grew up in a family whose life often followed the movement of the Army. When the Second World War began, Lucy joined the American Red Cross and served overseas during the conflict. Red Cross workers were often stationed close to the front lines, helping care for wounded soldiers and assisting with the enormous humanitarian needs created by the war. For many people who served in those roles, the experience left a lasting impression. Lucy saw parts of the world that few Americans at that time ever witnessed firsthand, places marked by destruction and recovery after years of war. When the war finally ended, and the world began trying to return to normal, Lucy came back to the United States. By the late 1940s, the old house had entered yet another chapter of its long life. Lucy's father purchased the property in 1947, and after his death the same year, it would once again become the center of someone else's life. This time, it would belong to Lucy and her mother. And from that point forward, the long story of that house and the unusual life of the woman who lived there would begin to intertwine. For people driving through 7 Mile Ford in those years, it must have looked like something from another time. Tall windows, massive fireplaces, wide rooms that echoed with the past. But inside, the Crockett family brought their own rhythm to the place. Lucy and her mother did their creative work there, writing and illustrating children's books together, and for a time, they opened part of their property to the public in a small shop they called the Wilderness Road Trading Post. Travelers passing along then US 11 and later Interstate 81 could stop in and find handmade items, crafts, and things the two of them had created themselves. In a way, it had returned to a role it had played previously, a place where people passing through the mountains might stop for a while before continuing down the road. But Lucy Crockett herself quickly became something of a local character. When she finally settled into the old Preston House after the war, the place became more than just a home. She gave it a name. In her letters and correspondence, she referred to it simply as Herondon. And there, Lucy began producing a remarkable amount of work. Between 1939 and 1963, she had published 9 books, 5 of which were written in Herondon. She wrote the stories herself, and she illustrated many of them too. Lucy wasn't just a writer, she was an artist. And one of her novels, The Magnificent, well, I'll let you figure out on your own the last word in that title, would eventually make its way all the way to Hollywood. In 1956, it was adapted into a motion picture titled The Proud and the Profane, starring William Holden and Deborah Kerr. The name likely changed because even in Hollywood in 1956, the original title of the manuscript would have been deemed somewhat inappropriate. So for a time, the woman living in that house in 7 Mile Ford, had a connection that stretched far beyond these mountains. From Appalachia, all the way to the silver screen. And yet, the place she seemed most connected to was still that same place she simply called Herondon. People who knew her often described her as private and independent, someone who kept mostly to herself. She shared the property with a handful of animals, including a dog she named, well, once again, I'm not going to say its name, but after researching Lucy, it was only fitting. Over time, stories about Lucy began circulating among people who lived nearby and throughout the region. Some were simple observations about a woman who preferred solitude. Others were stranger, and before long, Lucy Crockett herself would become part of that mystery. By the early 1960s, Lucy had been living there for several years, and sometime in 1963, Lucy began doing something that few people in Smyth County would have expected or even known. At some point during those years, Lucy began writing letters to Washington. Some were addressed to federal authorities, including J. Edgar Hoover, who was serving as the director of the FBI at the time. Others were reportedly sent to officials connected with the Central Intelligence Agency. In those letters, Lucy claimed she had information about what she believed might be an internal threat to the United States government. Exactly what she believed she knew isn't entirely clear today. But what does seem certain is that she felt strongly enough about it to contact people at the highest levels of government. According to accounts passed down from people familiar with the story, Lucy may even try to contact the White House. Some say she attempted to write President John F. Kennedy directly himself. Whether those letters ever reached the president is something no one has ever been able to confirm. But the letters did get someone's attention. Family members later recalled that federal agents eventually came to 7 Mile Ford to look into the matter. The FBI reportedly visited the property and spoke with relatives as part of an effort to understand who this woman was and why she had been sending letters to officials in Washington. For a brief moment in 1963, 7 Mile Ford drew the attention of investigators from the nation's capital. Over time, those letters led to another layer of speculation about Lucy that still circulates among people who have tried to piece the story together today. Lucy had served overseas during the Second World War as a Red Cross worker, a role that often placed volunteers close to military operation and government personnel stationed abroad. Because of that, some people who later heard about her letters wondered whether her wartime service might have connected her to something more than humanitarian work. During World War II, the United States operated a wartime intelligence agency known as the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, a predecessor to what would later become known as the Central Intelligence Agency. Over the years, a few people familiar with Lucy's story have quietly speculated that she may have had some sort of involvement in that, or some connection to that world. There's no historical evidence that confirms that idea, but like many stories tied to that old house, the speculation became another thread woven into the larger mystery surrounding Lucy Crockett and the life that she lived there. Lucy continued living there for many years, keeping mostly to herself in that large brick home that had already stood through nearly 2 centuries of history. Travelers still passed along the road. Cars and trucks moved through 7 Mile Ford, where wagons had once crossed the river. And the house remained, watching it all the way it always had. Relatives would visit from time to time, especially during the 1970s and the 1980s. They remembered gathering there for meals and family dinners, what they simply called going to the Ford. But those visits also revealed something deeply personal about Lucy. She had been extremely close to her father. When he died in 1947, people close to her say it changed her. Even years later, during family dinners at Herondon, Lucy would always set a place for him at the table, as if somewhere in her mind he might still walk through the door, or perhaps just to continue to honor her father. And if you read the letters Lucy wrote, you start to get a sense of her personality too. Direct, independent, and very private. In one typed letter, she ended a message with a line that might sum up her character better than anything else you'll ever hear. She wrote, "Please, relay to all inquirers that Miss Lucy Crockett is entirely unreachable." And in many ways, that may have been exactly how she wanted it. Because as the years went on, Lucy became harder and harder for the outside world to reach. People around Smyth County remembered Lucy in different ways. Some only knew her by her reputation, the woman who lived in the old brick house near 7 Mile Ford. Others remember seeing her from time to time when she would come into town. A friend of hers told me that when Lucy drove into town, she often arrived in an old army jeep, the kind of vehicle that already felt out of place on the roads around here. And Lucy herself looked a little different than most people you would see walking into a store in rural Appalachia. She often dressed in a style that reminded people of her military years: greenish pants, a khaki shirt, and spats covering the tops of her boots. And on her hip, well, was a revolver. And according to people who knew her, Lucy carried that revolver nearly everywhere she went. I actually remember seeing her once when I was a kid. It was in the Piggly Wiggly, or the Pig, as most people called it around here. I remember looking up and seeing this woman walk into the store dressed in that old military-style clothing, with the Jeep outside and the revolver on her side. And I remember thinking I had never quite seen anything like that before here in our little corner of Appalachia. At the time, it probably unsettled some people. But now, looking back, after learning more about her life and the things she had seen in the world, well, it feels like that was just Lucy. Some described her as independent and private, someone who preferred her solitude and the company of animals over large gatherings of people. Others remembered her as polite but guarded, a woman who carried the kind of life experiences that most folks in the valley could only imagine. And then, of course, there were peacocks. More than one person who remembers the property says peacocks wandered the grounds, their bright feathers and sharp cries echoing across the fields near the river. It was an unusual sight for rural Smyth County, and only added to the sense that the house and the woman living in it were just a little different from anything else anyone had ever seen. Over time, Lucy herself became part of the long line of stories connected to the property. Some people remembered the small shop she and her mother once ran from the property, and some remember the brief moment when letters from there had drawn the attention of an investigator from Washington. In her later years, Lucy became a little harder for people to understand. The woman who had once traveled the world and worked overseas during the World War II gradually began to withdraw more and more. People around Smyth County often described her as eccentric. She still came into town from time to time, sometimes driving that old army jeep, but she wasn't someone who welcomed many visitors anymore. Over time, Lucy became increasingly protective of her privacy. The place that had once welcomed travelers at the old Wilderness Road trading post slowly closed itself off from the outside world. Neighbors learned that Lucy preferred to be left alone, and the old brick structure, which had always seemed to gather stories over the years, once again became a place where very little was seen from the outside. For people driving past along the road, it was just another old house sitting in the fields near the Holston River. But behind those tall windows and thick brick walls, Lucy continued living her life largely out of the view. And like so many chapters in the long history of that house, the final years of Lucy's life passed with very few people watching. And eventually, the life of Lucy Crockett, like the many travelers who passed that way before her, came to an end. And that's where the story becomes a little uncertain. Even today, people who have tried to trace the details of her final years have struggled to find clear answers about what happened afterwards. Some accounts suggest that when Lucy died, her remains were handled quietly and without much public record. Even members of her extended family have said they were never entirely sure where she was ultimately laid to rest. And so, the house beside the road continues to carry its stories. Stories about frontier travelers and old taverns along the Wilderness Road. Stories about soldiers who once filled the rooms during the Civil War. Stories about cryptic writings scratched into places most people would never think to look. And stories about a woman who lived there in the 20th century, whose letters once reached all the way to Washington, D.C. Today, drivers still pass by there, often without noticing it. The building is still there, but its future is uncertain. In May of 2022, the property was sold, with plans announced for the development of a truck stop. What those plans mean for the house is unclear. There has been little public discussion about whether the old structure will be preserved. And restoring it would not be a small task. Even decades ago, Lucy herself wrote about the condition of the house, describing it as already fallen into disrepair. So today, the future of the Preston House, or Herondon, as Lucy called it, remains unsure. For now, it still stands quietly beside the road, much the way it has for generations. But, like many old places in Appalachia, its story may soon depend on whether anyone decides it is worth saving. And one more thing I feel like I need to talk about. I need to admit something. Something a little strange that has happened while putting this episode together. While writing these stories and trying to piece everything together, there have been a few moments where things just didn't seem to cooperate. Technology failing at the worst possible time. Videos I had saved suddenly disappearing. Pens running dry right in the middle of notes. Now, I don't claim to believe in that sort of thing, but after spending weeks digging into the history of this place, you can't help but notice when little things start going wrong. Almost like the story itself doesn't want to be told. Or maybe it's just a reminder that some places hold on to their secrets a little tighter than others. Because in Appalachia, places like this just don't disappear. They stay, watching the road and holding on to their stories. And like many places in Appalachia, it holds on to the memories of the people who passed through it, the parts we know for certain, and the shadows that history never fully explains. This has been Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memories. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.